My son looked at me, then laughed with his friends. "He's just the gardener," he said, as if those words could cut away the years I spent raising him. They chuckled, never knowing that the soil on my hands once built the very house they stood in. I did not answer. I only brushed the dirt from my gloves and watched the sun catch the brass key on my ring, the same key that would decide who truly owned this place. When he called me a gardener, he forgot one thing. Gardeners know when it is time to uproot the rot. This isn't just a story. It's a buried truth hiding in too many homes. If you're brave enough to face it, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching this reckoning unfold? That morning began like every other. The air was cool, carrying that faint sweetness that comes right before the sun warms the garden beds. I had been up since 6, trimming the hedges along the white fence and humming the same tune my late wife used to play on the piano. The rhythm of it kept my hands steady. There is something sacred about tending to a piece of land that has known your footsteps for 40 years. The brass key jingled at my belt as I moved from rosebush to rosebush. It was more than a key. It was a memory forged in metal. I had it cut the day my wife and I signed the deed to this home. Back then, Ethan was just a boy, running barefoot through the yard, shouting for me to push him higher on the swing. I never imagined that one day that same yard would hold so many silences between us. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. New families, new cars, and new manners of forgetting who built what. Most days I found comfort in keeping busy. My hands were made for work, not rest. I oiled the old gate hinges, watered the lawn, even swept the driveway before Ethan left for his job downtown. He had moved back into the house 2 years ago after my wife passed. He said it was to help me manage things. But as months passed, it became clear he had come to manage ownership, not memories. Melissa, his wife, rarely looked up from her phone when she crossed the porch. She always wore that polite smile, the kind that hides judgment behind courtesy. Once she thanked me for keeping the place tidy. She meant well, perhaps, but something in her tone made me feel like I was part of the staff, not the family. Still, I stayed patient. I told myself that love and time would smooth the edges. I had seen enough winters to know that bitterness kills faster than frost. So I kept tending the soil, talking softly to the plants as if they were old friends who still listened. That morning I noticed the roses near the front gate struggling. Their leaves curled inward, yellowing at the tips. I knelt, touching the soil, feeling how dry it had become. Ethan had forgotten to pay the water bill again, though the sprinkler system was his responsibility now. I reached for the hose, twisting the knob until water began to flow, slowly, unevenly. I watched it soak the earth and thought about how much like family it was. You have to keep feeding it, or the roots will dry out. From the kitchen window, I heard laughter. Melissa's voice, sharp but melodic, and another, Ethan's. I glanced through the glass and saw them seated at the breakfast table. They were dressed neatly, ready for work, coffee steaming between them. I wiped my hands on my jeans and gave a small wave through the window. Ethan barely nodded before looking back at his phone. That gesture, small as it was, cut deeper than it should have. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of lemon polish and burnt toast. My wife's framed photograph sat near the windowsill, her eyes soft, kind. "You would tell me to breathe," I whispered under my breath. "To stay gentle." I touched the brass key hanging beside the door. It had always been our symbol of stability, proof that we had built something solid in a world that changed too fast. Around noon, I took the old push mower from the shed. Its handle was worn smooth, the paint chipped where my hands had gripped it for years. The rhythmic hum of the blade soothed me. A few of the neighbors waved as they passed by in their cars. Mr. Daniels from across the street called out, "Still keeping it sharp, huh, Frank?" I smiled and nodded. "Some things are worth keeping sharp," I said. He laughed, unaware how those words meant more than just about the mower. When Ethan came out later that afternoon, dressed in a crisp shirt and polished shoes, he avoided my eyes. He was on the phone, speaking loudly about property value and potential buyers. The word stung. Property. Buyers. I turned off the mower, leaning on the handle as he walked past. "Everything all right, son?" I asked. He looked startled for a moment, then forced a smile. "Yeah, Dad, just business. Nothing to worry about." But I did worry. His voice had that nervous rhythm I had heard once before, when he lied about crashing the truck in college. That evening, as the sky turned orange, I sat on the porch cleaning the brass key. The metal caught the sunset, glowing like an ember. From inside I heard Melissa whisper, "He still thinks this is his house." My hand froze. The key slipped slightly between my fingers. For the first time I wondered if maybe it no longer was. Silence lingers before betrayal begins. That evening the house buzzed with a kind of energy I had not felt in years. Melissa was everywhere, arranging silverware, lighting candles, setting out bottles of wine I could not pronounce. Ethan had invited a group of his colleagues from the real estate firm, people who dressed like they were already celebrating their next promotion. They had come to see the house, he said. I did not realize until later that he meant it as his house. I stayed out of their way, as I often did. My space was the garden. Always had been. The air outside was cooler, honest. I was stringing fairy lights across the oak when I caught their reflections through the kitchen window. Melissa laughing, Ethan gesturing proudly, pointing toward the walls, the decor, the dining set. The house looked beautiful, but it did not look like home anymore. One of the guests, a tall man with a sharp haircut, wandered outside while taking a call. He saw me adjusting the lights and smiled politely. "Why, you do great work," he said, nodding at the yard. "How long have you been maintaining this place?" I wiped my hands on my jeans, choosing not to correct him. "A while," I said quietly. "Ethan is lucky to have you," he added before disappearing back inside. The words stung more than they should have. By 7, the laughter had spilled onto the porch. Glasses clinked, and someone turned on music too loud for comfort. I walked around the side of the house, collecting empty bottles, trying to keep the place tidy. It was habit more than duty. I did not mind cleaning. It was how I stayed part of things. Then I heard it. "Hey, who's that outside?" one of Ethan's guests asked. "You got staff working this late?" The laughter that followed was light, careless. But Ethan's voice carried through it all. "Oh, him?" he said, half drunk on attention. "He's just the gardener. Always takes his work too seriously." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Even the music seemed to fade. My hands froze around the bottle I was holding. Just the gardener. The words fell heavier than I expected. They hit something deep, something I had spent years building to protect myself from disappointment. Another guest chuckled, trying to smooth the tension. "Well, he keeps it spotless, that is for sure." Ethan laughed again, too loud, too false. "Yeah, he does not like to let go. Old habits die hard, right?" I stayed still in the shadows, my chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. I had faced worse insults in my life, but this was different. This came from blood, from my own son. I wanted to walk in there and tell them the truth, that the soil they stood on had once been a patch of rock I had turned into a garden with my own hands. That the down payment on this very house had come from 30 years of hard work and a back that still ached every morning. But I did not. Instead, I set down the bottle, brushed the dirt from my gloves, and walked to the patio. The lights shimmered over the table where Ethan sat, smiling at his guests. He looked up when he saw me, and for a moment his smile faltered. Maybe he saw the disappointment in my eyes, or maybe he just saw what he wanted to see, an old man with dirt under his nails. "Need anything else before I turn in?" I asked, my voice calm even. Melissa's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Oh, no, thank you. We are fine," she said, eyes darting nervously around the table. Ethan raised his glass. "Thanks, Dad," he said, the word sounding hollow after what he had called me. The guests did not catch it, but I did. I nodded, turned, and walked away. Behind me, the laughter started again, forced, uneasy. Outside, the air felt heavier. I sat on the porch step, the brass key cool in my palm. I turned it between my fingers, the metal catching faint reflections from the house lights. My wife used to say this key would always open our peace. Tonight it felt like it locked me out. As I rose to head inside, it slipped from my grip. The small metallic clink as it hit the patio stone was sharper than any word I could have spoken. I bent to pick it up, but left it there instead, watching how the moonlight touched it like an afterthought. Inside, the laughter carried on. Out here, silence spoke louder. The key lies on the ground as the first fracture of respect settles in. The next morning, the smell of roasted coffee drifted from the kitchen. I stood outside by the porch steps, looking at the small mark where my brass key had fallen the night before. It had left a faint scratch on the stone, thin but permanent. I picked it up, dusted it off and noticed it had bent slightly at the teeth. A key does not bend easily. Something heavy must press on it. That thought stayed with me as I turned it over in my palm. Inside, Ethan and Melissa sat at the table, both acting as if the night before had not happened. The morning light poured through the blinds, painting their faces gold, but the air between us was cold. "Morning," I said quietly. Melissa smiled, that polite, strained smile of hers. "Good morning. Sleep well?" I nodded and poured myself a cup of coffee. Ethan barely looked up from his phone. He was already dressed for work, tie perfect, shoes shining like polished glass. "You have plans today, Dad?" he asked without lifting his eyes. I looked at him for a long second. Nothing new. "The garden could use a bit of care," he nodded absently, scrolling through messages. "You should take a few weeks off, you know. Go visit Aunt Claire in Arizona or something. Melissa and I have some renovations to handle. Might get a little noisy around here." The words were gentle in tone, but they carried a current underneath. I heard it clearly. "He wanted space, not for me, but from me," Melissa added softly. "It would be nice for you to relax, Frank. You have done so much already." I set my cup down slowly. The sound of porcelain against the table felt like punctuation to a sentence no one wanted to finish. "I will think about it," I said, though we all knew I would not. I walked outside, the bent key still in my hand. The sun had begun to rise higher, glinting off the brass like a tiny flare. I tried straightening it against the edge of the wooden bench, pressing until my thumb hurt. The metal resisted. That was when I noticed an envelope sticking out of the mailbox. Official, sealed, addressed not to me but to Ethan Turner. The return address was from the county records office. I should have ignored it, but something about the timing just after that conversation made my chest tighten. I slid it free, weighing the envelope in my palm. Legal paper, heavy. I placed it on the kitchen counter beside Ethan's laptop, pretending nothing had happened. But the thought kept circling me like a hawk. What papers would the county be sending him? By noon I was back in the yard, pruning the bushes near the fence. The hum of traffic in the distance mixed with the rhythmic snip of shears. That sound usually brought peace, but today it only deepened the silence inside me. I remembered the day Ethan first learned to plant a tree. He was 8, knees muddy, face glowing with pride as he helped me dig the hole. "If we water it every day," he said, "it will grow taller than the house." I told him that roots mattered more than branches. Now, watching him drift further away, I realized how far those roots had cracked. Late afternoon, I saw Ethan step outside to take a call. His voice was low, urgent. "Yes, I got the documents," he said. "No, he does not know yet. Once the refinance clears, everything will be under my name." My heart slowed. Each word landed with the weight of wet earth. He turned suddenly, spotting me by the hedge. His tone softened. "Oh, Dad, you are still out here?" "You should rest," I nodded. I liked the quiet. He smiled awkwardly, then hurried back inside. The sun began to set, spilling orange light across the lawn. I stood by the porch railing, the bent brass key gleaming weakly in my palm. It used to unlock a home. Now it felt like proof of something slowly being taken apart, one signature at a time. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. The envelope was still there, unopened. The silence was thick, like soil packed too tight to breathe. I ran my thumb along the edge of the brass key and whispered, "What are you hiding, son?" Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and for the first time, the house no longer sounded like mine. Father glimpses the truth hidden inside official papers he was never meant to see. 2 days passed before I found the courage to touch that envelope again. It had sat on the counter like a quiet accusation, untouched but never ignored. The morning light crept through the blinds, catching the gold edges of the county seal. My hands trembled as I slid a knife beneath the flap. Inside were copies of financial records, a mortgage refinance agreement, and a property deed. My name was still there, but below it, faint and nearly fading, was a new addition. Ethan Turner and Melissa Turner, joint owners. At first I thought it was a clerical mistake. Then I saw the signature. My own handwriting, perfect, practiced, but I had never held that pen. I stared at the page until the letters blurred. There in black ink was the quiet theft of a lifetime. I had built this house with my wife brick by brick, saving every extra hour from the factory, every dollar from small repairs I did for neighbors. And now my own blood had turned it into a ledger line. That afternoon I went to the bank. The manager, Mr. Lawson, had known me for years. His smile faded as soon as he saw the papers. "I thought you were aware, Frank," he said cautiously. "Your son brought these in weeks ago." "The refinance went through easily. You co-signed." I lifted my eyes. "Did I?" He hesitated, tapping his pen. "Your signature was there. I assumed you approved it." The silence between us was cold. I folded the papers carefully, like they were glass. "No, Richard." "I did not." He looked down, shame flickering across his face. "If what you're saying is true, then that is forgery." "But you need proof. Proof." That word echoed all the way home. When I arrived, the driveway was lined with cars. Melissa was hosting what looked like a small gathering, neighbors, a few of Ethan's colleagues. They were laughing under the porch light, the same one that had seen too much truth already. "Frank," one of them called. "Ethan was just showing us the renovations. The place looks incredible." "You must be proud." "Proud?" I forced a small smile. "Yes," I said softly. "It has come a long way." Across the yard, Ethan stood near the front steps, drink in hand. When he saw me, he froze for a second, then lifted his glass in that hollow, polite way. I could almost hear the words he had once said echoing inside my head. Just the gardener. Inside the house, laughter spilled from every corner. People touched the walls, complimented the furniture, asked Melissa about paint colors. I stood in the hallway watching. Not one of them knew the truth, that the man holding the deed had stolen it from the one who built it. As the evening wore on, I overheard whispers near the kitchen. "It is good Ethan took over," one guest said. "Older folks sometimes forget to keep up with finances. At least the place is secure now." Melissa's voice answered lightly. "He is happier this way. Gardening keeps him calm, gardening. As if peace were a patch of weeds." I stepped out quietly before anyone noticed. The night air was cold, carrying the scent of cut grass and new betrayal. I walked to the side of the house, where my workbench stood under a small light. The brass key lay there, still slightly bent. I held it up against the moonlight. For a second it looked like a scar. Ethan came out not long after, slightly tipsy, tie loosened. "Dad," he said, pretending surprise, "you should come join us. Everyone's asking about you." I turned slowly. "Do they ask as a guest," I said, "or as the gardener?" He blinked, color draining from his face. "Come on, Dad, don't start this again." I walked closer, my voice low but steady. "You signed my name." He froze. The air between us went still. "What are you talking about?" "The refinance, the deed, the papers you filed." I held his gaze. "You used my signature." Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came. Melissa appeared behind him, eyes wide. "Frank, maybe we should talk inside." "No," I said quietly. "Inside is what you wanted for yourselves. I will stay where I belong." For the first time, Ethan could not look me in the eye. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. Then he turned and walked back inside. I stayed there a long time, the brass key pressing into my palm until it left a mark. By the time the last guest left, the house lights dimmed, and I could hear only the faint echo of laughter fading into night. But I did not laugh. I just stood there under the porch light, staring at the windows glowing warm with their shadows, and realized that warmth no longer belonged to me. Father uncovers the forged deed and faces the hollow sound of his own son's denial. That night, I barely slept. The house was too quiet, too carefully arranged, as if even the walls had learned to hold their breath. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a memory testing its weight. I sat in the dark living room until dawn, staring at the deed papers folded neatly beside the brass key. When morning came, I packed a small bag. Not because they asked me to leave outright, but because I could feel the invitation in their silence. Melissa's message came just after sunrise, polite as always. "We think it might be better if you took some time for yourself. Ethan will handle things here for now. Handle things." That phrase was sharp enough to bleed pride. I walked out back to the guest house, the small cottage I built when Ethan was a teenager. It had once been his art room, then storage, and finally my quiet space after my wife passed. The moment I stepped inside, dust greeted me like an old friend. The bed sagged a little. The curtains hung uneven, but at least the air was honest. I set my bag down beside the armchair, unrolled my sleeves, and sat by the window. The garden stretched before me, green, patient, alive. From this distance, the main house looked beautiful but cold, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I opened my old leather journal, the one my wife had given me for our 25th anniversary. The first page still carried her handwriting, for every thought you cannot say out loud. So I began to write. Ethan has changed. Maybe I have too. Maybe we both forgot the language of gratitude. The words came slowly, but once they started, they would not stop. I wrote about the laughter we used to share, about teaching him how to plant tomatoes, how he once cried when the first one ripened. I wrote about the pride in his eyes when he bought his first car, and how that pride now felt like a stranger's smile. By noon, my hand ached, and the page was wet in places I refused to name. Outside, I saw Ethan and Melissa carrying boxes from the car. New furniture, maybe, or more renovations. They did not look toward the guest house. Not once. That evening I found the courage to approach the main house. I turned the brass key in the front door, but it jammed halfway. I tried again. It twisted, but the lock would not catch. The feeling that followed was not surprise. It was confirmation. The door I had opened every day for 40 years no longer knew my touch. I stood there for a moment, hand on the handle, listening to voices faintly echoing from inside. They were laughing about dinner plans. The sound muffled by the door felt like laughter from another world. I went back to the guest house and set the bent brass key on the table. Its golden shine had dulled under the lamplight, its edges catching shadows instead of reflections. I traced it with my thumb and whispered, "So this is what being a guest in your own home feels like." That night I dreamed of my wife. She was standing by the kitchen window, smiling the way she used to when I came home late from work. "You built this place with love," she said in that voice that always softened me. "Do not let pride tear it down." When I woke, the dream lingered like perfume. The next morning I made coffee, strong and bitter, and carried it outside. The sunrise caught the dew on the grass, turning every drop into a spark of light. From across the yard, Ethan was loading something into his car. He noticed me, hesitated, then waved awkwardly. I raised my cup in silent reply, no words, no explanation, just distance. I sat back down on the steps of the guest house and opened my journal again. This time the words were slower, steadier. Maybe this is what loss really is, not the moment they leave, but the moment they stop seeing you as home. The brass key lay beside the open pages, cold and bent, catching the light like a reminder. I told myself I could still find peace here. That dignity could live in smaller rooms. But deep down I knew something else was coming. Something that would force me to stop pretending that silence was enough. Because when a man steals your name off a deed, he does not stop there. Father's quiet retreat turns into reflection, but a new resolve begins to take root. The following week passed in slow motion. From the window of the guest house, I watched my son live a life that no longer included me. He walked across the porch each morning in pressed shirts, phone pressed to his ear, voice full of confidence I had once been proud of. Now it only sounded like distance. Melissa's laughter carried through the garden as she planned a summer reveal party for the house renovations. Every laugh felt like a hammer hitting another nail in the coffin of what we used to call family. I stayed quiet. I tended to the soil, fixed the fence, kept the lawn alive, not for them but for myself. Routine was how I stayed human. Still, silence can sharpen into resolve. One afternoon I drove into town to visit an old friend, Richard Grayson, my attorney since the day we bought the house. His office was small and smelled faintly of paper and dust, a comforting smell for someone like me who had always believed in things you can hold. He looked up from his desk and smiled. "Frank Turner, it has been too long. What brings you in today?" I placed the folded papers on his desk without a word. He scanned the first page and his expression darkened. "You did not sign this, did you?" "No," I said evenly, "but someone wanted the world to think I did." He leaned back, taking off his glasses. "Your son?" I nodded once. That was all it took. Grayson flipped through the documents methodically, tracing the ink like a surgeon finding the wound. "This is a clean forgery," he muttered. "Same pen pressure, but slightly off in the loop of the T. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. But there is one thing they forgot. Witnesses. There are none listed here. That makes the signature legally void." I sat quietly, letting his words settle. "Can we fix it?" He smiled faintly. "We can do more than fix it. We can restore what is rightfully yours, but we will do it quietly. Quietly suits me just fine, I said. He pulled out a folder, began drafting new filings. We will need to notify the county registrar, freeze any future refinancing attempts, and file a report of suspected forgery. It might take a few weeks, but by the end, he will be standing on air while you hold the ground. I nodded slowly. Good. Let him think he has won. Let him decorate the walls while I reclaim the foundation. Grayson chuckled under his breath. You always had a poetic way of getting even. I smiled faintly. It is not revenge, Richard. It is correction. When I returned home that evening, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the yard. I passed Ethan's new car in the driveway, gleaming. Proud. The kind of pride that only lasts until truth catches up. Inside the guest house, I laid the brass key on the table and began polishing it with a soft cloth. Its edges were smoother now, the bend nearly gone. It was almost whole again. I thought of how objects, like people, sometimes needed pressure to find their shape. The next morning, Melissa waved to me from the porch. Morning, Frank. The place looks beautiful as always. Thank you, I said simply, keeping my voice calm. Ethan appeared behind her, a bit wary. We appreciate everything you do, Dad, I nodded. I know you do. He frowned, unsure whether it was gratitude or warning in my tone. I left him to wonder. For the next few days, I kept my distance but not my attention. I heard their arguments late at night about money, about credit cards, about some loan delay. I watered the lawn, trimmed the hedges, and waited for Grayson's call. It came one Thursday afternoon. His voice was steady. The report is filed. The county will send notice within 10 business days. Ethan's name will be frozen from all transactions until verification. He will not know yet. Imperfect, I said. Let him plan his party. I hung up, stepped outside, and breathed in the smell of fresh-cut grass. The brass key hung from my belt again, polished, ready. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. That evening I saw Ethan and Melissa out on the porch, laughing with friends again. The house glowed behind them, perfect in its new paint, but I knew what they did not, and the ground beneath their laughter had already begun to shift. I turned off the garden lights one by one, letting darkness return to the yard. Then I whispered to myself, we will see whose name the house remembers. Father's quiet resolve forms into a plan. The gardener prepares his first unseen strike. The day I put my plan in motion, the sky was calm, that kind of steady blue that hides a coming storm. I woke early, the way I used to when I still worked full-time and brewed a pot of black coffee. The brass key rested beside my cup. Its shine restored, its edge straight again. It caught the morning light like a promise. From the porch of the guest house I could see Ethan pacing near the front gate, phone to his ear. He spoke with that same quick arrogance I once mistook for ambition. Yes, the transfer went through, he said, laughing. The house is finally ours. I'll send you the new photos once the landscaping is done. My father's gardener keeps it in good shape. My father's gardener. I smiled faintly. The words no longer cut. They simply confirmed how far he had drifted. A son who could lie so easily would have to learn truth the hard way. I slipped on my gloves, picked up the pruning shears, and began trimming the roses. They had overgrown in my absence, wild but still beautiful. Every cut was careful, deliberate, clean. It was not anger that guided my hands. It was patience. Justice, like gardening, required both. By mid-morning, the neighbors began to notice me again. Mrs. Cole from next door leaned over the fence. "Frank, it is good to see you working again," she said. "We missed you out here." I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "Some things do not grow right if you leave them unattended," she smiled knowingly. "That boy of yours is lucky to have you." I did not answer. Luck had little to do with it. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove off in a rush, leaving tire marks on the driveway. Melissa was on the porch, arranging flowers that looked too perfect to be real. She waved as I passed, a small flicker of guilt behind her smile. "Thank you for keeping the place so lovely, Frank," she said. I nodded, then paused. "Melissa," I said quietly, "you ever think about how fast seasons change? One day you are planting roots and the next the ground shifts beneath you." Her smile faltered. "I suppose that is true." I gave a slow nod. "Just remember that." "Ground remembers." She turned back toward the door without replying. I went to the tool shed where I kept old records, maintenance logs, bills, even copies of the original construction permits. Every piece of paper told a story. I stacked them neatly, tied them with twine and set them on the workbench. Those would soon matter more than the flowers blooming outside. 2 days later, Grayson called. "Everything is in place," he said. "The notice of ownership correction has been filed and signed by the county clerk. The sheriff's department has the documents. They will be delivered in person within the week." "Good," I replied. "Let them deliver it while I am pruning." Grayson chuckled softly. "You always had a sense for poetic timing." "It is not poetry, Richard. It is balance." That evening I stood in the garden and watched the house lights flicker on one by one. I could see silhouettes moving inside, my son and his wife setting the table laughing. To anyone else it looked like an ordinary home. But I knew the truth. The foundation beneath them had already shifted. I spent the next few mornings in plain sight, mowing, trimming, watering. The neighbors waved, and a rumor began to spread that I had sold the house to Ethan, but stayed on as caretaker. I let it grow. Lies like weeds reveal their own roots. One afternoon, Ethan came out and handed me an envelope. "Very small bonus," he said, smiling too wide. "For all your work." I opened it slowly. Inside were a few bills, nothing compared to what he owed. I looked at him calmly. "Thank you, son," I said. "It is good to feel appreciated." He seemed relieved. He had no idea how wrong he was. As he walked back inside, I slipped the envelope into my pocket, right next to the brass key. Both felt like symbols, and that one false, one true. The air thickened, heavy with rain. I looked at the roses swaying in the breeze and whispered, "It is almost time to prune again." The father stands quietly as the legal storm gathers, ready to reclaim what is his. The morning the sheriff's car rolled up the drive, the sky was clear, eerily so, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. I was in the garden, sleeves rolled, hands deep in the soil. The roses had begun to bloom again. Their timing could not have been better. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan's friends' cars already parked along the street. He was hosting another weekend get-together, a showing of sorts. I could hear their laughter floating through the open windows, light and careless. Melissa's voice rose above the chatter. "It is good to finally have everything in order." I smiled faintly and kept trimming. The brass key at my belt caught a flicker of sunlight gleaming against the green. Then came the crunch of gravel beneath heavy tires. A white county vehicle stopped just short of the porch. 2 uniformed deputies stepped out, their expressions polite but firm. The taller one adjusted his hat and looked at the clipboard in his hand. "Afternoon," he said. "We are looking for Mr. Ethan Turner." Melissa appeared first, confusion flashing across her face. "That's my husband." "Is something wrong?" The deputy nodded once. "We have a court order to serve regarding property ownership and occupancy." Inside the house, voices dropped. Laughter stopped. Ethan came out, wine glass still in hand. "There must be a mistake," he said, trying to sound calm. The shorter deputy opened a manila envelope, thick with documents, and handed it to him. "This is an official eviction notice and property title correction, effective immediately. You will have 30 days to vacate the premises. Further details are enclosed." Ethan blinked, disbelief twisting his face. "Eviction? This is my house." The deputy glanced at his clipboard again. "According to the county records, it belongs to Mr. Frank Turner." For a moment, time stopped. I kept pruning the roses, the sound of the shears crisp in the stunned silence. The neighbors, drawn by the noise, began to peek over fences. Their curiosity grew as quickly as gossip does in any small town. Melissa's voice broke first. "There has to be some misunderstanding. Frank would never—" I stood then, wiping my hands on my gloves, moving slowly toward them. "Afternoon, officers," I said evenly. "Everything all right?" Ethan turned to me, face pale. "Dad, what is this?" I looked at him quietly, then at the papers trembling in his hand. "That looks like your name," I said softly. "You might want to read the fine print this time." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The guests on the porch shifted awkwardly. One of them whispered, "Is that his father?" Another murmured, "I thought he said the old man just worked here." Their words fluttered through the air like insects. I bent to pick up a stray rose petal from the ground and placed it gently on the garden wall. "Funny thing about roots," I said, my voice low but clear. "You can paint over the branches all you want, but the roots always remember who planted them." The deputies nodded politely toward me. Sir, paperwork is complete. We will follow up in 30 days. Thank you, officers, I said. As they walked away, Ethan stood frozen, the envelope shaking in his grip. His friends avoided his eyes, quietly excusing themselves. Within minutes, the yard that had been full of chatter was silent again. He finally looked at me, anger and confusion wrestling in his expression. "So you planned this," he said, his voice breaking. I met his gaze evenly. I corrected what was wrong. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "Frank, please," I held up a hand. "No need to explain. The soil knows when it has been poisoned. It takes time, but it heals." The wind picked up then, carrying the scent of roses across the yard. The brass key glinted at my waist, warm from the sun. Ethan's voice fell to a whisper. "What are we supposed to do now?" I turned back to the garden, shears in hand. "You could start by learning to dig," I said quietly. "It teaches you what effort really means." I began pruning again as they stood there silent, surrounded by the echo of a truth they could no longer avoid. The first cut of the blade was clean and final. Public humiliation meets justice. The father stands unshaken as the community witnesses the truth. By the next morning, the story had already spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Small towns do not need headlines, just curious eyes and open porches. People talked in grocery aisles, at church steps, and over fences trimmed with gossip sharper than any shears. "They say Ethan forged his father's name," one woman whispered near the bakery. "I heard he got served papers right in front of his friends," another added. By noon, the tale had grown wings. Some said I threw him out myself. Others claimed the sheriff dragged him from the yard. Truth, as usual, was quieter and less entertaining. I turned off the garden lights one by one, letting darkness return to the yard. Then I whispered to myself, "We will see whose name the house remembers." Father's quiet resolve forms into a plan. The gardener prepares his first unseen strike. The day I put my plan in motion, the sky was calm, that kind of steady blue that hides a coming storm. I woke early, the way I used to when I still worked full-time, and brewed a pot of black coffee. The brass key rested beside my cup, its shine restored, its edge straight again. I had caught the morning light like a promise. From the porch of the guest house, I could see Ethan pacing near the front gate, phone to his ear. He spoke with that same quick arrogance I once mistook for ambition. "Yes, the transfer went through," he said, laughing. "The house is finally ours. I'll send you the new photos once the landscaping is done. My father's gardener keeps it in good shape." My father's gardener. I smiled faintly. The words no longer cut. They simply confirmed how far he had drifted. Our son, who could lie so easily, would have to learn truth the hard way. I slipped on my gloves, picked up the pruning shears, and began trimming the roses. They had overgrown in my absence, wild but still beautiful. Every cut was careful, deliberate, clean. It was not anger that guided my hands. It was patience. Justice, like gardening, required both. By mid-morning, the neighbors began to notice me again. Mrs. Cole from next door leaned over the fence. "Frank, it is good to see you working again," she said. "We missed you out here." I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "Some things do not grow right if you leave them unattended." She smiled knowingly. "That boy of yours is lucky to have you." I did not answer. Luck had little to do with it. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove off in a rush, leaving tire marks on the driveway. Melissa was on the porch, arranging flowers that looked too perfect to be real. She waved as I passed, a small flicker of guilt behind her smile. "Thank you for keeping the place so lovely, Frank," she said. I nodded, then paused. "Melissa," I said quietly, "you ever think about how fast seasons change? One day you are planting roots, and the next the ground shifts beneath you." Her smile faltered. "I suppose that is true." I gave a slow nod. "Just remember that. Ground remembers." She turned back toward the door without replying. I went to the tool shed where I kept old records, maintenance logs, bills, even copies of the original construction permits. Every piece of paper told a story. I stacked them neatly, tied them with twine, and set them on the workbench. Those would soon matter more than the flowers blooming outside. 2 days later, Grayson called. "Everything is in place," he said. "The notice of ownership correction has been filed and signed by the county clerk. The sheriff's department has the documents. They will be delivered in person within the week. Good, I replied. Let them deliver it while I am pruning. Grayson chuckled softly. You always had a sense for poetic timing. It is not poetry, Richard, it is balance. That evening I stood in the garden and watched the house lights flicker on one by one. I could see silhouettes moving inside, my son and his wife setting the table, laughing. To anyone else it looked like an ordinary home. But I knew the truth. The foundation beneath them had already shifted. I spent the next few mornings in plain sight, mowing, trimming, watering. The neighbors waved, and a rumor began to spread that I had sold the house to Ethan, but stayed on as caretaker. I let it grow. Lies, like weeds, reveal their own roots. One afternoon, Ethan came out and handed me an envelope. A small bonus, he said, smiling too wide. For all your work. I opened it slowly. Inside were a few bills, nothing compared to what he owed. I looked at him calmly. Thank you, son, I said. It is good to feel appreciated. He seemed relieved. He had no idea how wrong he was. As he walked back inside, I slipped the envelope into my pocket, right next to the brass key. Both felt like symbols. One false, one true. The air thickened, heavy with rain. I looked at the roses swaying in the breeze and whispered, it is almost time to prune again. The father stands quietly as the legal storm gathers, ready to reclaim what is his. The morning the sheriff's car rolled up the drive. The sky was clear, eerily so, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. I was in the garden, sleeves rolled, hands deep in the soil. The roses had begun to bloom again. Their timing could not have been better. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan's friends' cars already parked along the street. He was hosting another weekend get-together, a showing of sorts. I could hear their laughter floating through the open windows, light and careless. Melissa's voice rose above the chatter. It is good to finally have everything in order. I smiled faintly and kept trimming. The brass key at my belt caught a flicker of sunlight, gleaming against the green. Then came the crunch of gravel beneath heavy tires. A white county vehicle stopped just short of the porch. Two uniformed deputies stepped out, their expressions polite but firm. The taller one adjusted his hat and looked at the clipboard in his hand. Afternoon, he said. We are looking for Mr. Ethan Turner. Melissa appeared first, confusion flashing across her face. That's my husband. Is something wrong? The deputy nodded once. We have a court order to serve regarding property ownership and occupancy. Inside the house, voices dropped. Laughter stopped. Ethan came out, wineglass still in hand. There must be a mistake, he said, trying to sound calm. The shorter deputy opened a manila envelope, thick with documents, and handed it to him. This is an official eviction notice and property title correction, effective immediately. You will have 30 days to vacate the premises. Further details are enclosed. Ethan blinked, disbelief twisting his face. Eviction? This is my house. The deputy glanced at his clipboard again. According to the county records, it belongs to Mr. Frank Turner. For a moment, time stopped. I kept pruning the roses, the sound of the shears crisp in the stunned silence. The neighbors, drawn by the noise, began to peek over fences. Their curiosity grew as quickly as gossip does in any small town. Melissa's voice broke first. There has to be some misunderstanding. Frank would never... I stood then, wiping my hands on my gloves, moving slowly toward them. Afternoon, officers, I said evenly. Everything all right? Ethan turned to me, face pale. Dad, what is this? I looked at him quietly, then at the papers trembling in his hand. That looks like your name, I said softly. You might want to read the fine print this time. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The guests on the porch shifted awkwardly. One of them whispered, Is that his father? Another murmured, I thought he said the old man just worked here. Their words fluttered through the air like insects. I bent to pick up a stray rose petal from the ground and placed it gently on the garden wall. Funny thing about roots, I said, my voice low but clear. You can paint over the branches all you want, but the roots always remember who planted them. The deputies nodded politely toward me. Sir, paperwork is complete. We will follow up in 30 days. Thank you, officers, I said. As they walked away, Ethan stood frozen, the envelope shaking in his grip. His friends avoided his eyes, quietly excusing themselves. Within minutes, the yard that had been full of chatter was silent again. He finally looked at me, anger and confusion wrestling in his expression. "You planned this," he said, his voice breaking. I met his gaze evenly. I corrected what was wrong. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "Frank, please." I held up a hand. "No need to explain. The soil knows when it has been poisoned. It takes time, but it heals." The wind picked up then, carrying the scent of roses across the yard. The brass key glinted at my waist, warm from the sun. Ethan's voice fell to a whisper. "What are we supposed to do now?" I turned back to the garden, shears in hand. "You could start by learning to dig," I said quietly. "It teaches you what effort really means." I began pruning again as they stood there, silent, surrounded by the echo of a truth they could no longer avoid. The first cut of the blade was clean and final. Public humiliation meets justice. The father stands unshaken as the community witnesses the truth. By the next morning, the story had already spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Small towns do not need headlines, just curious eyes and open porches. People talked in grocery aisles, at church steps, and over fences trimmed with gossip sharper than any shears. "They say Ethan forged his father's name," one woman whispered near the bakery. "I heard he got served papers right in front of his friends," another added. By noon the tale had grown wings. Some said I threw him out myself, others claimed the sheriff dragged him from the yard. Truth, as usual, was quieter and less entertaining. He smiled. "Justice has a strange way of feeling both heavy and light, doesn't it?" Outside, the sky had cleared. Sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps as I walked down. The brass key in my pocket warmed against my palm, almost alive. Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the pavement. For a second, he looked like the boy I once taught to ride a bike. Unsure, lost, scared of falling. He opened his mouth. "Dad, but I walked past him. Not out of cruelty, out of preservation." Some truths needed silence more than forgiveness. The father wins in court, but victory tastes hollow. The son stands stripped of pride, and the distance between them widens. The house was quieter than I had ever known it. No music, no chatter, no sound of footsteps rushing down the hall. Even the air felt heavier, as though it had learned to mourn on its own. The blinds stayed closed most of the day, and the porch light that once burned until midnight now stayed dark. It had been a week since the hearing. The 30-day notice had begun its slow countdown. Ethan and Melissa barely left the house. The mover's truck sat idle in the driveway, like an unspoken sentence waiting to be carried out. From the garden, I watched them through the window. She moved mechanically, packing one box after another. Ethan, once so full of voice and motion, now moved like a man underwater. There was no triumph in watching it, only a deep, quiet ache. Every morning I still tended the garden. It was habit, maybe comfort. The sound of the shears, the rhythm of pruning kept me steady. The roses were at their second bloom of the season, bright, full, forgiving. They did not seem to care who owned the soil beneath them. One afternoon, Melissa stepped outside carrying a box labeled kitchen. She paused at the steps, hesitating when she saw me. "Frank," she said softly, "would you like these? They are just some old dishes your wife bought years ago." I thought, maybe they belong with you. I looked at the box. The same plates my wife used for Sunday dinners, each one with tiny painted violets along the rim. "Thank you," I said, my voice catching just slightly. "She would have liked that." Melissa nodded. "I am sorry," she whispered. "For everything." "I know," I said gently. "And I believe you." She turned away, her shoulders trembling as she carried the rest inside. That evening I walked the perimeter of the house. The sun was sinking, and the golden light touched the windows one last time before disappearing behind the trees. Through the glass I saw Ethan sitting at the dining table, head in his hands. The deed papers lay beside him, open but unread. It struck me then how heavy silence could become between two people who once spoke freely. I stepped closer, just enough to see his reflection in the glass. He looked older, not by years but by choices. After a long minute he raised his head, sensing me outside. Our eyes met through the pane, two generations divided by a thin sheet of glass and a mountain of regret. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Finally I turned away. Back in the guest house, I placed the brass key on the table. Its metal caught the dying light, glowing soft and steady. I turned it slowly between my fingers. It no longer felt like a weapon or a burden. It was simply what it was meant to be, a key, something that opens, something that closes, something that endures. I remembered Ethan as a boy, chasing fireflies on a summer night, running barefoot through the grass, his laughter echoing through the yard. He had called out, "Catch one for me, Dad." I had cupped my hands around the tiny light, holding it gently before letting it go. Back then, I thought I could hold on to moments forever. Now I knew better. The next morning, a light knock came at the guest house door. I opened it to find a small envelope resting on the step. No sound, no footprints, just the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in Ethan's familiar script. "Dad, I do not expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I remember who taught me to work with my hands. I remember the garden. I lost sight of the roots. I am sorry." Folded inside the note was something else, a photograph. The two of us, years ago, kneeling beside the first rose bush we planted together, my arm around his shoulder. Both of us smiling without fear or pride. I sat down slowly, the photograph trembling between my fingers. The garden outside swayed in the breeze, the roses bending as if listening. "Maybe there is still something worth saving," I murmured. For the first time in months, the air inside the house felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but alive again. The son's letter opens a crack of remorse. The father holds the first fragile seed of forgiveness. By the time the leaves began to turn, the story had finished making its rounds through town. The fire of gossip had burned itself out, leaving only quiet respect in its wake. People who once waved politely from a distance now stopped by the fence offering kind words or warm casseroles. "Frank," Mrs. Cole said one morning, leaning on her rake, "we all misjudged things." I guess folks only see what they want to. "You were never just the gardener," I smiled softly. "That is all right, Margaret. Sometimes people need a season or two to see the roots beneath the soil." Her eyes watered. "You handled it better than most would. Dignity suits you, Frank." "Dignity," I repeated under my breath after she left, tasting the word like something I had forgotten how to pronounce. The garden was full again. Roses, marigolds, and rows of tomatoes ripening faster than I could pick them. Life had a way of returning when you let it. Every morning, I found a quiet rhythm between watering and reflection. And yet, the house across the yard still stood half empty, a shell echoing with what used to be laughter. It had been 2 weeks since Ethan and Melissa moved out. They left behind furniture, dishes, and the faint smell of paint from their renovations. But what lingered most was the silence. One afternoon, I found myself walking through the front door for the first time in months. The brass key turned easily now. No resistance, no jam, just a clean click. The air inside smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. I moved from room to room slowly, my steps careful, as if I were walking through memory instead of space. In the living room, sunlight fell across the same spot where Ethan had laughed with his friends, calling me just the gardener. Now, only the echo of that night remained, soft, harmless, and distant. On the kitchen counter lay a small stack of mail forwarded from their new address, and beneath it something else, a white envelope marked in Ethan's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter folded neatly, written with shaky lines that betrayed a sleepless hand. "Dad, I will not make excuses. What I did came from pride, not need. I wanted to prove I could build something on my own, but I used what you built instead. I see now that I did not lose a house, I lost my compass. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. If not now, maybe later. I will wait." Ethan and I read it twice, then a third time. Each line carried the weight of years unspoken between us. There was no defense, no justification, just truth stripped bare. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my journal. On the page beside it I wrote, "Forgiveness is not owed. It is planted." That evening the neighbors gathered in small groups outside, drawn by the golden sky of early autumn. Mr. Daniels called out across the fence, "Frank, you going to the community dinner this Saturday? They are honoring you for maintaining the neighborhood gardens." I chuckled. "I did not do it for honor," he grinned. "That's exactly why you deserve it." His words settled in quietly. For the first time, I felt the community not as a crowd that watched, but as one that understood. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the brass key hanging from its nail by the door. The house glowed softly behind me, no longer haunted but still learning to breathe. The wind carried the scent of rain and soil, the kind that promises new growth. I thought about Ethan's letter, about the kind of courage it takes to admit guilt. Maybe he had finally learned what real ownership meant, not of a house but of responsibility. I closed my eyes and said quietly, "Some roots rot, but others find a way to grow back." The next morning, I decided it was time to replant the old flower bed near the porch, the one Ethan helped me dig as a boy. It had lain empty for years. Perhaps it was ready for something new. Father begins to see the first buds of reconciliation as the town restores his dignity and his son reaches out from afar. The morning began quietly, with a silver mist hanging over the garden. Dew clung to the grass like tiny mirrors, reflecting the soft light that spilled from the horizon. It was the kind of morning my wife used to love, the kind that made even silence feel alive. I had been thinking about Ethan's letter for days. The words had settled in me like slow rain, soaking deep, working quietly. He had not asked for the house back, nor money, nor comfort, only understanding, and that, I realized, was worth something. So I did what I have always done when the heart is heavy. I worked the soil. The flower bed near the porch had long been bare, its wood frame weathered and soft. I took the shovel from the shed and pressed it into the ground. The earth gave way easily, almost grateful to be turned again. The smell of soil rose up rich and forgiving. Each scoop felt like a memory, of small hands digging beside mine, of laughter, of lessons buried under time. I planted a few rose cuttings, careful and deliberate. Beside them I placed a young sapling, a maple, its roots eager, its stem fragile. "Grow straight," I murmured, "and do not be afraid of the wind." The brass key hung from my belt as I worked, tapping softly against my leg. It had always been a symbol of what was mine, but today it felt like something more. Ownership, I thought, had never truly been about deeds or doors. It was about stewardship, about tending what outlasts you. Around noon, I drove into town to meet Grayson. He had prepared the final paperwork to re-establish my name as sole owner. When I arrived, he handed me a folder but paused before I could sign. "Frank," he said, his tone softer than usual, "you could keep it all if you wanted. No one would blame you." I looked at the line where my name stood alone. "I do not need to keep it," I said quietly. "I just need to protect it long enough to pass it on the right way." He smiled knowingly. "You have something in mind?" I nodded. "A partial inheritance, not now, later, but with conditions." He raised a brow. "Conditions. Respect. Work. Humility," I said. "He earns it, or it stays where it is." Grayson leaned back in his chair, chuckling. "You have a farmer's sense of justice, Frank." I smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes the field needs burning before it can grow again." When I returned home, I placed the signed documents in my desk drawer, locking them with the brass key. For the first time in months, the sound of that lock closing did not feel like an ending. It felt like balance. Later that evening, the neighbors gathered near the garden for a small dinner. The air smelled of grilled corn and damp earth. Laughter floated easily this time, genuine and unforced. Mr. Daniels raised a glass. "To Frank Turner," he said. "The man who reminded us that roots matter more than roofs." The crowd chuckled, clinking glasses. I raised mine quietly, replying, "To lessons that grow slower than we want, but stronger than we expect." As the guests began to leave, the sky burned orange and gold. I stayed outside, kneeling near the new rosebed. The soil was still damp, holding the first promise of life. A light breeze brushed across the yard, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. And then I heard footsteps on the gravel. I turned. Ethan stood at the gate, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. He had lost weight, and humility had softened the edges of his face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Can I come in?" he asked finally, voice low. I nodded toward the garden path. "If you are willing to get your hands dirty." He smiled faintly, relief flashing behind tired eyes. "Always," he said. I handed him a small spade. Then help me plant this last one. Together we dug in silence, the shovel slicing into the earth in slow rhythm. There were no grand speeches, no apologies left to say, just the quiet language of shared work. When we finished, I pressed the soil around the roots, firm and steady. "Roses take time," I said. "You cannot rush them." He nodded. "Neither can people." We stood together as the sun dipped behind the trees. For the first time in years, the air between us felt unburdened. The brass key hung between us, glinting faintly in the fading light. I turned it once in my fingers before slipping it into my pocket. Not yet, I thought, but soon. Father restores balance, prepares the ground for forgiveness, and invites his son back into the soil of their shared history. The next evening came with a soft drizzle, the kind that blurs porch lights and turns silence into something gentle. I was sitting on the steps of the guest house, oiling the hinges of my old pruning shears, when headlights swept across the driveway. Ethan's truck pulled in slowly, its engine idling before cutting off. He sat inside for a long time, his silhouette frozen, as if rehearsing a conversation that refused to form. Finally, the door opened, and he stepped out holding a small clay flower pot. The soil inside was fresh, a single white rose cutting planted carefully in the center. He walked toward me with slow, hesitant steps. "I figured it was time I planted something of my own," he said. His voice was low, uncertain, stripped of its old bravado. I looked at the pot, then at him. "White roses," I murmured. "Your mother's favorite." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I remember." For a moment, the rain fell between us like a curtain, thin, silver, and quiet. He stood there, shoulders hunched, clutching the pot like it was all he had left to offer. "Dad," he began, his voice trembling, "I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not even know if I deserve to ask. But I was wrong, every part of it. I thought owning that house would make me feel like you, steady, respected. I thought the deed would give me roots, but I see now the roots don't grow on paper." I stayed silent, watching the rain collect on his collar, his hair plastered to his forehead. There was nothing left in me that wanted revenge, just a tired ache, the kind that turns pain into perspective. He kept talking, words breaking between breaths. "When the sheriff handed me that envelope, it wasn't just an eviction notice, it was a mirror, and I didn't like the man looking back. I've been thinking a lot since then, about Mom, about how you built everything with your hands while I tried to buy mine ready-made." He set the pot down gently on the step between us. "I ruined what you trusted me with, but I want to earn it back, not the house, not the land, just your respect. I can live anywhere, but not being your son. That's what's been killing me." Rain pattered softly on the leaves behind us. I looked down at the little flower pot, soil dark from the drizzle, and then at the brass key hanging at my belt. Its surface gleamed under the porch light, steady, patient, waiting. I took it off the chain, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. When I finally spoke, my voice came slow, measured. "Ethan, a house can be stolen with a signature, but respect can only be built one truth at a time. You cannot buy it and you cannot forge it." He nodded, eyes brimming. "I know." I extended the key halfway toward him, letting the moment stretch. "You may enter," I said softly, "but not as an owner, only as my son again." He stared at it, tears cutting faint trails through the rain on his face. When he finally reached out, his hand shook. He did not take the key, he just covered my hand with his. That's all I ever wanted to be. The silence that followed felt sacred, neither forgiveness nor punishment, just understanding. After a long while, I stood and nodded toward the garden. "Come on," I said. "Help me plant your mother's rose before the soil gets too heavy." He smiled weakly, wiping his face. "Yes, sir." Together we knelt in the rain, pressing the cutting into the ground beside the new rose bed. The earth was cold but soft, welcoming. We worked without words, side by side, the way we used to. When we finished, I patted the soil once, firm and sure. "She used to say white roses mean remembrance," I said quietly. Ethan looked up. "And what do red ones mean?" "Endurance," I said, "because love that lasts has to survive more than bloom." He nodded, gaze lowering again to the soil. "Then maybe we'll plant both," I smiled faintly. Maybe we already have. He stayed for dinner that night. We did not talk much, but the silence felt different now. No longer the space between us, but the bridge. The son's repentance and the father's restraint meet at last. The seed of forgiveness takes root beneath the rain. By spring, the garden had come alive again. The roses, red and white together now, bloomed side by side, their colors bleeding softly into each other like two seasons learning to share the same sky. The maple sapling had taken root, its small leaves trembling in the wind, with the courage of something that refused to die twice. Ethan came by often. Not out of guilt anymore, but out of rhythm. Every Saturday morning, I would see his truck parked by the gate, a bag of fertilizer in the back, a coffee cup in his hand. He never knocked. He just started working. The sound of a shovel striking dirt became our new way of saying good morning. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Both felt right. Melissa came once or twice too, bringing pie or cuttings from her new garden across town. She and Ethan were renting a small house nearby, one they tended themselves. I think that mattered more than they ever said aloud. She smiled more now, quieter, genuine. One late afternoon I stood near the porch, polishing the brass key one last time. Its surface was smooth again, its curve true. It had lived through betrayal, through silence, through truth, and now it glowed in the setting light, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Ethan was in the yard, trimming the hedge line. He straightened when he saw me walking toward him, the key resting in my palm. "You remember what I said about this?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "That it's not just a key, it's a reminder." I handed it to him, my fingers closing around his. "Then you'll remember what it cost to hold it." He looked down at it, blinking hard. "Dad, I don't know if I can take this yet." "You already have," I said gently. "The moment you learned that work is worth more than title, and apology is worth more than excuse." His hand trembled slightly as he held it. "I'll keep it safe," I smiled. "Don't use it. Let it open the right doors this time." We walked together to the center of the garden, where the white rose bush stood in full bloom. The same one he planted that night in the rain. Its petals were wide open now, defiant in their purity. He knelt beside it, digging a small hole near the base. I watched in silence as he lowered the brass key into the soil and covered it gently with earth. When he finished, he looked up at me. "Is this what forgiveness feels like?" I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said quietly. "Forgiveness is what grows after." The wind stirred then, rustling the leaves above us. The evening light fell soft across the yard, painting the house in gold. For the first time in a long time, it looked like home again, not because of ownership, but because of peace. I could almost hear my wife's laughter in the kitchen, the clatter of plates, the faint tune of her humming. She had always believed that family was a garden. You couldn't force it to bloom, but you could tend it with patience. Looking at Ethan now, I finally understood what she meant. As the sun dipped below the trees, I turned toward the porch. "You hungry?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Always. Then wash up. Dinner's ready." He followed me inside, leaving the garden behind in quiet bloom. Through the window, the soil where the key rested caught the last trace of sunlight. A small glint, like a promise sealed beneath the roots. That night, as we ate in the same kitchen where we had once fallen silent, the house finally breathed again. After the dishes were done, I stepped outside one last time. The air was cool, the roses still wet with dew. I looked toward the flower bed, where the ground shimmered faintly under moonlight. "The gardener never leaves," I whispered to the dark. "He just waits until it's time to plant again," I smiled, feeling the kind of peace that comes not from victory, but from return. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love and still found the strength to forgive, you already know how it feels to let go of the key. Night settles. A single cricket keeps rhythm, and the camera lingers on the rosebush where the key lies buried.